In the late 90s, the implementation guide, reference guide for prescribed fire and wildland fire use was developed, and there were a number of requirements that this guide held. And one of them was to complete a wildland fire implementation plan. If one had a fire that advanced and became more complex, you went from a stage 1 to a stage 2 to a stage 3. And one of the requirements for completing a stage 3 WFIP, which is referring to the Wildland Fire Implementation Plan, was that a FUMA, Fire Use Manager, needed to oversee the development of this implementation plan. And so that was one of those requirements that we developed some training and a skill position, and the Fire Use Manager was the position that managed that portion of the planning effort associated with a wildland fire use, is what we termed those fires at that time. So that was a position that was successfully used over more than a decade, when we developed the 2009 implementation strategy for the federal wildland fire policy, there were a number of changes that occurred, one of which was eliminating the distinction of wildland fire use as a separate type of fire from all other wildfires. In so doing, the requirement for a fire use manager fell away because the WFIP stage 1, 2, and 3 were no longer required. Rather than a wildland fire implementation plan, we required a wildland fire decision support system documentation. And there are opportunities to include a long-term implementation plan, which is very similar to the WFIP stage 3, in a wildland fire decision support system process. But we have no requirements for a skills position to manage that portion of the documentation and the planning. We do recognize, though, that the skills associated with the old fire use manager are still very important and needed anytime we have a fire with a long-term element. And when I say long-term element, I usually use a frame of reference of more than 3 days. And I use that based on my assessment of our ability to predict weather. I think we have a pretty good handle on today's weather, tomorrow's, and even a couple of days out. But after that, more long-term forecast, the accuracy starts tailing off. And so we get into an area of great uncertainty about weather and its influences on fire behavior. And so when we get into that area of uncertainty, that's where the long-term implementation plan comes into play in identifying contingency actions, management action points, and what one might do under a variety of weather scenarios to ensure the fire will continue to meet the objectives that were established for it. So again, the folks that were trained to be successful fire use managers, we want them to continue participating in the planning efforts associated with fires that have a long-term element, again, more than 3 days, regardless of the objectives. Even a fire that is strictly protection objectives, and we're making every effort every day to minimize the spread of the fire, the efforts that a fire use manager and this new SOPL position can bring to bear on the planning associated with that, with a fire of a long-term nature, can provide much benefit to the successful achievement of objectives for that fire. And I'm speaking for the Forest Service, although Interior is likely not going to push this very far either, as far as assigning SOPLs concurrently at the Type 3 and above level. There's going to be a lot of judgment on the full complexity of the incident, and if there are too many moving pieces, that SOPL wouldn't have the opportunity to serve very successfully as an incident commander and develop that long-term plan, even in a Type 3 incident in the interior. At the Type 4 and 5 level, as long as there's not too many different resources on the fire, the SOPL can safely manage the fire as well as work on development of that long-term implementation plan for a fire of with a long-term element. That doesn't mean they have to. There's an option, and the SOPL can also provide support to a number of incidents within an area to provide that long-term planning element in support of a number of fires with long-term elements. One of the skills or attitudes that we have ingrained in the old fire use managers and now this new position, the strategic operational planner, is the ability to approach a fire with the idea that there are risks and opportunities on every fire. And so when the strategic operational planner is assigned to a team, although traditionally the ops and the planning section folks have the responsibility for doing that long-term planning, oftentimes they get focused on the near term, the next 12 to 48 hours. Assigning a strategic operational planner will alleviate that other need of the longer term, the outlook planning that the strategic operational planner can take on. At the same time, that strategic operational planner has in the back of their mind all the time the idea that they're going to look for opportunities, as well as opportunities to achieve a benefit, as well as opportunities for containment. And that's a concept that isn't very well firmly ingrained in most of our planning and operation folks. Most of our planning and operation folks have their whole mindset on where and how can we stop this fire in the safest, most economical manner, where the strategic operational planner kind of has a little broader way of approaching the fire, and a good understanding of what the land management plan desired condition statements are, and where and how this fire is burning, those opportunities the fire may hold for achieving some of those desired conditions, or moving us closer to those desired conditions. So it's one of those positions, skills, attitudes that can be a great benefit or an asset to an incident management team in not only helping to what if the fire and develop contingency actions for control points or containment points, but also take a look at where the fire is burning, how it's burning, and the opportunities to achieve a benefit with this unplanned ignition. The interactions with both planning and operations that a strategic operational planner needs to be successful at includes the idea that the planning and ops have a mission, and that the strategic operational planner is going to be providing support for that mission, not dictating it. And so there does need to be some sensitivity in the interactions, particularly as we start using this position more and more on fires that have very strong and important containment objectives, and some opportunity for resource benefit achievement. And so that strategic operational planner needs to integrate themselves in the team in a manner that is not overbearing or dictating, but in a manner of one that's providing support and assistance to the achievement of the overall objectives of the fire and the overall objectives that the local host unit has for managing that particular piece of ground. So it can be a very sensitive position in the way the individual inserts themselves or gets integrated into an incident management team. If they are a standard part of the team, of course, they can deal with that prior to the fire. If they are an add-on part of the team, then they need to walk very carefully in how they do integrate themselves into that overall team management. The other uses of a SOPL at this time would include being part of a decision support module. And this is not a standard grouping or definition of any kind of unit, but the Rocky Mountain region, for instance, has a decision support module that they have established to provide support for any level of management team assigned to fires in that region. And the idea there is they would have fire behavior forecasting skills, as well as SOPL skills to provide support for Type 4, Type 3, or even Type 1 or 2 operations on an as-needed basis. They also can be assigned to a host unit to help in the development of a course of action for a fire of any significance. One of the other aspects of managing a fire for the long term, once one develops a course of action in a WFDSS, it needs to be viewed as a dynamic document. As a fire proceeds over the course of a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that initial course of action is going to need to be maintained and updated based on where the fire has moved and changes in seasonality of fire danger, as well as temporally specific weather changes. So frontal passages that are predicted, worsening weather as the season progresses, and those kind of things will require review and update of that long-term plan within the course of action. And the SOPLs have the training and expertise to not only develop it, but to manage that over the long course of the fire. And so again, any fire of a long-term element, and again, I'll go back to my definition of that, it's more than 3 days where you've exceeded the accuracy of your weather forecasts. The SOPL skills can be brought to bear to help successfully manage a fire. Most of our operations and planning folks are just being exposed to long-term strategic planning, long-term risk management, and many of them are struggling with it, many of them are grasping it and running with it, but the strategic operational planner has been doing this for years and has been trained in those skills and knowledges associated with that kind of thinking and that kind of longer-term planning. Again, the bulk of our firefighters have some exposure to it, but not a lot of experience, not a depth of experience, and so they're engaging in the training, but haven't got the depth of background in actually doing that kind of thing. So the strategic operational planner could be very instrumental in helping us move forward in this direction to successfully conduct these planning efforts and inform decisions on Type 2 and Type 1 incident management team assignments.
Good.
The strategic operational planner skills and abilities will continue to be needed on into the future as we manage fires with long-term elements. I know a lot of folks have talked about ultimately transitioning out of that position. We talked about that with fire use management teams and other specific skill sets that we developed and used in the old wildland fire use program. With the 2009 implementation strategy and the increased flexibility of how we respond to wildfires, these skills are going to be needed more than ever in being successful in redeeming this flexibility in a safe, economic manner.